This is the For Freedom Podcast. This podcast exists to bring to light the legalism and abuse in the independent fundamental Baptist movement, and to encourage believers to grow in grace through the Scriptures. Now, here's your host, John Hollyfield.
I am your host, John Hollyfield, and I'm excited about today's episode. I'm just going to introduce it real quick, and then we'll get into the interview. But around February of this year, I was scrolling through Facebook and saw that a former classmate from Bible college, Stephanie Kittleson, when I knew her, Stephanie Helms in college, had posted on Facebook that she had done an interview about her time in the IFB. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Somebody is interested in doing something like that in a podcast. So I immediately clicked on the link, listened to the episode, and I thought I was fascinated. And then found out that this guy had, Eric Skwarczynski, had developed an entire podcast of listening to abusive stories within the independent fundamental Baptist movement, and I was riveted. So I immediately started to listen to every single episode that he had done thus far, and I thought, you know what? Now is the time to tell my story. I'm not bitter. It's been 7 years since I had left, and so I said, you know what? This is the time. So I reached out to him, and then the following week we scheduled a time, and he interviewed me on my time in the IFB, and after that, you know, I thought that that would be it, but it's sort of the burden kept growing and growing in my heart that I wanted to do something to speak out on this as well, and do so from my perspective as a pastor, as an elder, as somebody that can, you know, provide biblical theology to combat some of the teachings that I think are wrong in the IFB. So I started the For Freedom podcast in June, and got some other things in the works as well. And now we come to a moment where I'm able to interview Eric. And so this is an interview on confronting abuse. So I get a chance to interview Eric Skwarczynski, the host of the Preacher Boys podcast. He also is the host of the Good Story podcast. And so he does a lot of work. He has the preacherboysdoc.com and is working on a documentary on the abuse within the independent fundamental Baptist movement. But more importantly, Eric is also the husband to Tara and the father to an energetic little girl named Piper. And he's a family guy. And so we had a wonderful time and just talked about some subjects. We got a chance to get Eric's perspective on a lot of the on what he's doing and the work he's doing and the nature of abuse and those kinds of things. As so many times he is on the other end and not doing as much talking and listening, give him a chance to open up and talk about some things. So I hope you enjoy this. Here's the interview with Preacher Boys podcast host Eric Skwarczynski. Okay, and I'm here with Eric Skwarczynski. Eric, how you doing, man? It's good to have you on.
Pretty good. I just started working out again, so I'm super sore. But other than that, doing pretty good. So
Wonderful. Hey, this is a huge, monumental occasion for me because a lot of what I'm doing with my podcast and trying to get biblical counseling certification to branch that into a bigger ministry really was awakened by your podcast, the Preacher Boys podcast, and then you allowed me to come on and share my story, and then I just knew that was God was putting a burden on my heart to do something as well to people, you know, with similar experiences. So I really doing a episode series for the For Freedom podcast on abuse. I really wanted to have you on because you have spurred a movement within the independent fundamental Baptist world confronting the abuse. And I think if I title this episode, it's going to be confronting abuse. And because that's basically what you've done. Before we get into a couple of the questions that I have for you, I wanted to just mention this because I think it's worth mentioning. You started the podcast in January,
Right.
and the impact of the Preacher Boys podcast in these last 9 months. I think that the podcast has grown very popular.
Yeah.
As far as the podcast rankings and those kinds of things, I think you have some stats on that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's been in and out of different charts. Like it was top 40 or 50 true crime, like among all shows, through Chartable, which is like one of the most respected like podcast ranking sites. Haven't cracked into Apple's top charts yet, but I'm sure it'll get there at some point. It's hit 260,000 downloads, which is just crazy. And the site's gotten, I mean, yeah, almost well over 50,000 visits to the website, 99,963 page views. Like it's been pretty, it's just been wild. Like it's something that this kind of kicked off with me going out to my car when the Giovanelli situation happened and just recording a 10-minute rant, and I'm not the person that goes out and does that about everything. Like I've never done that before. And even like right after I did it and posted it, I was like, was that dumb? Should I have not done that? Because I always hate seeing people's videos like in their car responding to stuff. But it really was, for me, it was a boiling point of I need to talk about this. Like at this point, if anything else happens, I feel like I need to at least have done my part to say something. And when the podcast took off the way it did, like I did not expect it to, I know everyone says that, but I truly did not expect it to be hitting, in 5 years, 260,000 downloads. Like I thought it would be my friends, family, and a few other people. And it's just exploded. And I don't know where to put credit for that, because it's just, it's wild.
Well, I wanted to bring that part of it up because I think because people don't realize how much of a familiarity or a connection that people that have left the movement or been involved in any type of abuse within a church feels. And it's sort of, and this was the next point, was the discussion board, a sense of community. I mean, the discussion board's gone through some growing pains, but I mean,
Right.
well over 1,000 members.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's one of those weird things with the show. And I was telling someone this a little while back. I was saying it's kind of bittersweet when you see how many people it resonates with. On the upside, like every milestone that feels like it should be in any other podcast, you'd be like, oh, wow, like we're hitting crazy numbers, there is some of that. But then on the other side, it's sad that so many people relate to the heavy topics we're talking about on the show. And I think where I see that most clearly is through the discussion group that we have. And yeah, it's been through growing pains, and there's people in there who've just left the church, there's people who are still in the church who are trying to make sense of this. There's a very wide group of people in that, and by design. Like I want it to be a place where literally anybody could go. And for the most part, I think it's been successful in that. Like sometimes I'm even like, oh, it's gotten too negative in certain parts, and got to remind people here like what it's about. But for the most part, like it's been a very encouraging place. People able to share like, what's affected them, what's impacted them. And, one thing I just see in every single thread is no matter what experience someone mentions, there's 20, 30, 40 people that are all sharing the same experience. And so it's been a good spot for people to connect, communicate. Obviously, this is a heavy subject. So, sometimes people let the worst part of them out and, get into a fight here and there. But for the most part, it's been a lot of encouragement, and it's cool seeing 1,000+ people just supporting survivors of abuse and sharing those experiences with each other.
Yeah. And I think, we talked about before we started recording about maybe how maybe the impact of the podcast has affected investigations starting, because there are new investigations that are going on with situations within the independent fundamental Baptist movement and sexual abuse. Also, I think the most meaningful impact has been, people getting help, survivors getting help. And I think even in the discussion board, I mean, you're what, 60 something episodes in? And
like 65 or something like that.
And probably 95% of that is testimonials, stories, people telling their story of abuse. But you talk about a message board there's so many more stories of people that haven't been heard on the podcast. And I think that the whole idea about this thing is people in some way or another have been receiving help.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and I just want to say that I mentioned this at the beginning too, like there's a lot of people who've been having big impacts in areas that I haven't. And most of the people who have gotten help from the show is from me connecting them with someone who, has experience dealing with trauma, with legal counsel, things like that. And so I definitely don't want to take credit for all of the good work that's been done. I've a lot of people that have been hugely instrumental. And I mean, even way longer since I've been doing this, Joy Ryder with Out of the Shadows has been doing amazing work and helping. I mean, I don't know how many girls get comfortable sharing their story. I've got Amanda Householder with Circle of Hope, a crazy amount of good work there.
Jerry Massey.
And, say again?
Jerry Massey.
Yeah, Jerry Massey has been doing. I mean, Jerry Massey was kind of the OG of doing this kind of work, right? And so there's all those people, and nothing that I've been able to do would not be possible without them. And at the end of the day, I know we talked a little bit about Hopewell and things like that. At the end of the day, it takes survivors willing to come forward and them sharing their story, but. Yeah, it's been amazing. And I know people, look at the show and the podcast and see 60 episodes, but that's a fraction of people I get to talk to every week and communicate with. And it really is, I don't know. It's hard to communicate just how many contacts I get every single week. There was one week where someone was one of my friends was kind of harassing me about responding to a message. And I was I'd stopped because I'm petty, and I counted up all of my Twitter messages, Facebook messages, emails. And I was it's Wednesday. And I was I've already gotten 19 Facebook messages from 19 different people, just reaching out about different cases, different issues and needing help and things like that. And I've gotten thousands of messages from doing the show. And some of the coolest stories are stuff that I can't even share because it's stuff where I've been able to connect someone with a good lawyer. I've been able to connect people with, someone like Amanda who, is doing amazing work with exposing reform schools and things like that. And there's even I had a private investigator reach out to me just 2 days ago that said, "Hey, I've been investigating this organization and I came across your YouTube video and I have questions for you." And I was able to connect them with 2 or 3 people that I knew could help them. And so there's a lot of cool stuff on the show, but there's also there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that have reached out that have shared heartbreaking stories. And, I've been able to at least be there to, listen at the very least. And at the best, been able to connect them with someone who can actually help. So.
Yeah. That's it, yeah, and I'm thankful for it, and I think this can lead into the next question because I think sometimes people can misunderstand the podcast,
Right?
And I've heard people from a range of responses. Oh, he's just bitter. Why is he trying to attack the church as if the Independent Fundamental Baptist is the church? Different responses. So. And I know you've stated this before, even on your own podcast, but for just one more time, what is your mission and your purpose in the podcast?
Well, I mean, the mission in short, is to shed light on abuse, physical, mental, and sexual within the Independent Baptist movement. And I think people hear that, and the biggest questions I get are, you know, either why do you hate Christianity in general? And, you know, I'm quick to say, have you listened to podcasts? Because I'm definitely a Christian. But the other is why narrow in? Like, why have such a narrow focus? And I get tons of messages. Why don't you focus on the Catholic Church? Why don't you focus on public schools? Why don't you focus on, you know, fill in the blank with any organization that they perceive has a greater, lesser form of abuse? And I mean, just first of all, the it's not a contest of who has the most, what organization has the most abuse. I do think that with how small the Independent Baptist movement is, the amount of abuse is shocking. And I think statistically, I think it's on par with any abusive organization you can think of. But I think on the flip side of that too, the reason I'm dialed into this movement is because I grew up in this movement. I know this movement. And, you know, I often ask people, I'm like, would you expect a Catholic, a former Catholic to do an episode about Baptist abuse? It wouldn't make sense. You're going to start with your experiences, and that's all I can do. And also, there just hasn't been a lot of work done in this area. Like, I know there's been people who have done a lot of great work, but there hasn't been a consistent hammering away and keeping this in the public eye the way that there has been for the Catholic Church or for any of these other religious organizations. And then just on the question of bitterness, I said this on one of the shows, but you know, I'm not bitter in the sense of I want every IFB church indiscriminately to be shut down and all that kind of thing. That's not my heart at all. I am angry that this is something that hasn't been addressed in a meaningful way. It's been addressed by people like Jerry Massey and things like that, but it hasn't been addressed by in-house leadership in a very consistent way. And so I would just say, I mean, at the end of the day, there's only so much I can do to say I'm not bitter. I mean, I think my actions speak louder than words in this area. I had two pastors either last week or last 2 weeks that reached out and said, hey, I don't like your podcast. They straight up said, I don't like your podcast. I'm not a fan of yours. I don't like how you address certain things. But do you have any resources you'd recommend to help prevent abuse within our churches? And I just respond, thanks for being honest, and, you know, mail off some resources that would be helpful to them, or send them links to things that would be useful. But I think when they reach out, they perceive that I'm some kind of, you know, vindictive, angry, you know, if they have IFB in their name, you know, I'm going to be mad at them. But I have a lot of respect and sincere respect for the guys that have reached out and said, hey, we don't know what to do in this area. Can you help? And usually my answer is no, but I know a couple of resources that will, or there's someone I know that could talk to you about this. So yeah, the bitterness thing comes up frequently. I don't know how else to address it aside from, like, I feel like if people listen to the show, they'd probably not come away with that. But also most of the pastors that reached out, I just try to get them on the phone. Same with church members, or I talk to the college student for about an hour. Like, you know, if I said someone's upset about what I'm doing, I like to just get on the phone and just like, hey, I'm a real person. Let's talk about it and kind of go from there. But yeah, I don't know how else to address that aside from, you know, I'm not, I'm not here to see, every IFB church shut down. And I know that there's, you know, Anon accounts or other sites that have been out that have tried to do that, but that's not been a goal of mine whatsoever.
Okay.
So.
Well, you sort of in that answered the third question I had about how do you respond when somebody says the IFB is not the only group that had sexual abuse, or why single out the IFB. So for that reason, I'm going to throw. I just thought of another question.
Yeah.
And that is, yes, due to, I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement boasts of itself of being independent. So it's not like they wouldn't say that they're hierarchical denomination like the Catholics, or even, you know, the way they characterize the Southern Baptist Convention. So you think of, you know, with the sexual abuse scandals, there had to be a response from the Pope, right? There had to be some type of response from many of the leadership in the Roman Catholic Church. I think was it a year ago or 2 years ago when the Houston Chronicle came out about the Southern Baptist
Right.
abuse scandals, and Al Mohler actually on his podcast, The Briefing, spent an entire episode, and it shocked me because I'm used to just whenever people talk about this, we don't gossip. That's air quotes. We don't gossip. We stay quiet about it. And here is Al Mohler on his Briefing podcast addressing the article and not going on the defensive. He actually, in that podcast episode, and I'll try to see if I can find it and link it, he actually talks about how judgment has come to the door. I think that was the title of his article, of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he ends by basically saying, we've got to do better. And so with that being said, should abuse be addressed by IFB leadership if they're independent? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And I think it's a tricky thing to explain to someone who's outside of it. But I think anyone who's been within that movement knows it's not independent. There's a definite structure. You know, I was thinking about it literally this morning. You know, these churches say they're independent, but they hire exclusively from one Bible college, or they say that they're independent, but they specifically have a certain circuit of preachers that come in. And, you know, again, are there, I had someone that reached out that said, hey, my dad started a church on the side of a road in a back country of this area, truly independent. He just happened to be Baptist. I said, yeah, I'm not talking about him. And again, I always direct people like, hey, listen to the show and hear what I have to say. But when it comes to the IFB and leadership speaking out, I see them do it for a ton of other issues. And I see them come together on bus ministry topics, on, you know, they have soul winning conferences, they have leadership conferences, all these things where a very certain, you know, they have political conferences, and everybody there is from a certain, that independent Baptist denomination. They all go to this area. They all are, you would think that they're a convention. They all go together. You don't see anyone from outside the independent Baptist world coming to these conventions or to these conferences. And so I guess my thing is, if they can take the time to unify and address, you know, new taxes on diesel buses or things like that, why can't they come together and address abuse in the church? This is not to say that every pastor is responsible for what happens in every other pastor's church, but it is disingenuous to say that there is true independence in that movement. You know, I just listened to the Recovering Fundamentalist podcast with Phil Kidd. I'm still not a Phil Kidd fan. I haven't converted to be a fan of Phil Kidd, but you know, if you just listen to the way that he described his time being part of the independent Baptist movement, it was a huge, like, there was a structure to what you were supposed to do, what you weren't supposed to do. And even though there's not a pope or a president or a fill in the blank of the movement, there are definite leaders that control large portions. For me, growing up in the West Coast, it was Paul Chappell and Jack Trieber. It was, which side are you on of that group? For Indiana, Jack Hiles. And again, it's, sure, they may not have the title, but if Paul Chappell decides to do, you know, 4 people leading worship on the stage and as a worship team, there were a lot of pastors who were against that before he said it was okay. And so there's definite, again, like I said, if you're within the movement and you're saying it's not, you know, no one's affiliated, we're all independent, like, you're just being disingenuous. Like, I don't know how to address it aside from when you're in it. You know, I grew up as a staff kid in an IFB church. I saw the people that come in. There was a very definitive kind of ranking of who's who, and, you know, who goes where and where do we hire from and that kind of thing. So,
yeah, I think the most glaring thing, and I know this gets, you know, the Jack Scott situation gets brought up, it's because it was the most recent and it was the biggest, most high profile.
yeah.
I remember in February of 2012, I went to a marriage retreat at Clarence Sexton's. Jack Scott was the featured speaker. Okay. July is whenever he's arrested. Following February, we go back to said marriage retreat at Clarence Sexton's. Not a word is said. I specifically looked for, because they have their tables with all the books and all the stuff, and they have the CDs you can buy of every previous marriage conference since they started it. And I went over there specifically and looked for the previous years. Of course, it wasn't on there. I mean, it was just like completely hush. You totally forget. It's like erased from your memory that Jack Scott was here last year. Like he never existed in the IFB world. We're just going to wipe that clean.
Right.
Instead of, I had him at my church a few months before he was in sin when he was preaching here. Let's address this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's that kind of goes into the argument I always hear is, talking about abuse makes the church look bad. Like if we call out like, oh, this just happened, and we kind of report on the times where someone missteps or a leader falls, but my thing is, when you try to make things just disappear, especially now in the internet age where nothing disappears, all it takes is for someone to look up a name, look up fill in the blank. And, that's when it looks bad, because that's when it looks like there was a cover up. If you can see a statement, like if Clarence Sexton got up and said, we just wanted to address this, one of the speakers we had, unbeknownst to us, was, basically preying on a teenage girl from his church, I would have a lot more respect for that. And I don't think that makes the church look bad. I think that makes the church look like it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is to call out wrongdoing and sin. I mean, so, but I mean, in the network, I just remember this as you said this, but one of the things that pushed me to start the podcast was when the Cameron Giovanelli situation happened. And there was literally a pastor from the church letterhead sending out to all of his pastoral friends, a letter saying, hey, let's raise support to help pay the legal fees of Giovanelli. And it's like, again, if you could become unified enough to pay legal fees for a self-confessed pedophile, like, why can't you come together and say, hey, what can we do to improve our church nurseries? Like, what process can we go through to make sure our place is safer than what it is? So it just, to me, of all the conferences held about soul winning and about, dress standards and youth conferences that we see every year held with, 2,000, 3,000 kids bussing in, it seems like we could put a little bit more effort into talking about this issue.
I totally agree. I want to move back to number 2 that I had. And so this is more of a personal question. And I've heard, different testimonials from you from different episodes you've done on the podcast. So I'm interested to see how specifically you would ask this. So why, you obviously are passionate about this. All right.
Right.
If you've listened to your podcast at any time, or even listened so far to the interview thus far, you're obviously passionate about this. You've put in the time, the effort, I'm guessing your own money into going forward with this effort.
Right.
Where does that passion come from? Why this subject? Why are you passionate about this?
So I'll give just a condensed version, but I mean, so I grew up in the movement. I was a staff kid. I spent 7 days a week for the first 18 years of my life, like on a campus of an IFB church and school. And things were great. Like I had all my friends are from there. I still am connected with a lot of people there. I had a good relationship, with my youth pastor. I laugh because I had so much like shame about, being like this wicked, kid. And it was like, I was like the epitome of like, oh, I'm a good Christian boy, whatever we think of from that kind of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was the kid who was like literally like Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Saturday soul winning. I was going to my youth pastor's house Saturdays to, just hang out. Like I just hung out with my youth pastor and like we'd, make pizza and, talk and all that stuff. And, I was not just a bitter, rebellious kid. Like I was not. So basically what happened was when I was in the summer after 11th grade, basically Jesse Rule was sent to our school. And for those not familiar with the story, I mean, it's one Google search away. But basically he came to our church suddenly, started volunteering in our 6th grade Sunday school, was leading music. And, I knew Jesse from previous stuff with like basketball tournaments and stuff. And so I texted one of the guys on his team and was like, hey, are you going to miss your youth pastor and coach that just left after all these years? And he's like, no, he didn't say goodbye to us. Like, we're not, we're kind of upset. And so I Googled to see if the church had said something or if his staff page was moved, and the first thing that popped up was an article, saying that he had a physical relationship with a babysitter who was like 16, I think at the time, 15. He was 30. And so for me, it was like, one, it burst my bubble of like, oh, this is my safe religious zone where like nothing bad happens here. Like, sure, the Catholics, we hear about them all the time. Pastors talk about that, or here, the public school system, or, fill in the blank. So first it just made me go like, oh, this happens in IFB churches. Like I'd never even thought about it. But then two things happened. One, I spent the majority of the rest of that year and that summer trying to get someone to listen to me about like this not being good. And, my youth pastor, to even my parents at the time, to everybody, I was like, this guy just came here suddenly and we're not going to say anything about it. And eventually he got pulled from like leading music for a while, and teaching Sunday school. And I just kept pushing. I was like, we need to tell the church about this. Like, not because he did something at our church, but I just kept saying, I was like, it doesn't make sense to not say anything or to let people know we're a church, we have a Christian school. I'm like, I feel like parents would want to know this. And just nobody would like take it seriously. Nobody would listen. And eventually he was back up on stage singing. Like, no, my thing was he got sent here. He didn't say why he was here. And he just kind of got away from what he did and just relocated. And so eventually ended up back on the platform. Like if you tune into a live stream of the church now, he introduces every single sermon. He's still front and center, and for me, it was a lot of me just trying to get people to wake up. Like, hey, this is bad. Like, I know I'm an 11th grader or going into 12th grade, but like, it's common sense. This is not smart. And then the next thing that happened out of that is because nobody would listen, I started becoming a little bit isolated. So my youth pastor cut off contact with me for the most part. Like, I wasn't going to his house anymore. He was telling me I was bitter. That relationship kind of got severed over this. Other people were starting to get upset. It hurt my relationship with my dad for quite a good period. I mean, we've always been the type, like we always go to bed, say, I love you and all that stuff. But it definitely fractured that relationship quite a bit because I just was like, how do you not see this as an issue? But as I became isolated, I started looking into these cases of abuse in the IFB. And, I started seeing names of people I recognized. Like, here's a speaker that I recognize. Here's, I read I Fired God by Jocelyn Zichterman. I was like, oh, I recognize Jeff Call's name. He came to our church and spoke all the time. And I just kept going through David Gibbs. Like, David Gibbs was like a favorite speaker when we would go to conferences. And I was like, wait, he was involved with this and with that. And, oh, my pastor's pastor, they always mention in the sermons, is Jack Hiles. And, and Jack Hiles did what? And it just kind of like, it quickly made me question the safety of where I was at, which I think it should have. And it just made me wonder, like, why is my pastor like lovingly quoting Jack Hiles when Jack Hiles was like not a upright moral man? Why are we having David Gibson when he defended pedophiles at fundraisers to pay for their legal fees? And so when I left when I finally left my senior year, I was bitter. And I was really upset because, I felt like I didn't know who to trust. I didn't have all of my connections and leaders that I looked up to had kind of just failed me in a lot of areas. And, my youth pastor I looked to as like basically like a second dad. I mean, he cut off ties over this. So I was bitter. I had bottled this up for a year and a half and, tried to get someone to hear me. But over the period of the next couple of years, like it switched from being bitterness. Like I truly don't feel bitter now. I truly don't feel, but I do feel passionate that same way about like, listen to me. Like there is a problem here and nobody's listening. No, everybody's acting like everything's fine, but it's not. And I think once you see, and I think that's what's happening with the podcast, people are seeing the veil get lifted a little bit and they're saying like, oh, it's also that church. And it's also this conference speaker I loved. It's also this camp speaker that I loved. And again, do I think that we need to be bitter toward the movement as a whole? Definitely not. I don't think so. But do we need to ask really hard questions about like, why has this been allowed for so long? Yes, I think that does need to happen. And so I guess my passion is that same thing that was like 11th grade me feeling helpless, saying, hey, there's a wolf among lambs kind of thing, to steal Stacy Shiflett's book title. There's a wolf here and nobody's taking it seriously. And so the passion for me is just, let's show it for what it is. Let's have an honest conversation about it. And let's fix the things that are allowing this to keep happening over and over and over again. I said that was a short answer, but I guess I lied. But,
Well, do you think, and I applaud you because at a young age you did that. I did not. I failed in that aspect because as a college student, drinking the Kool-Aid, if you will, was involved. Well, I wasn't involved. I was, just a couple people removed from knowing about a situation between a staff member and a teenager. And here we are, me and a couple of other guys sitting there talking about, somebody should say something. Somebody should say something. And the whole reason why we don't is because we feel like we're going to get in trouble and look like we're going to be on the wrong side of a staff member. We want to look good in their eyes, and they're going to be mad at us for gossiping.
Right.
Well, eventually somebody says something to somebody, and that person goes to a staff member. The guy's fired and moved out quietly. Like the church is never given an explanation whatsoever. Right. He's just gone. And one of the other guys that was in the group that found out about it, that we were trying to get to say something, he had his face ripped off by another staff member. And the phrase that was used was, your gossiping ruined this man's life. Never mind the fact that guy came to the ministry because he was writing love notes to a teenager there, and the pastor had to do something with him. So he called the pastor of the church that I was at in Arkansas and said, hey, can you take this guy? And they took him. And then eventually he went into another ministry after he left there. Now, I would like to see something done about that, but the girl that was involved has never, come forward. And I totally, that's her. But, I look back at this. I was telling a friend of mine the other day, I said, there's not a week that goes by where I don't think about that situation.
Yeah.
And think about, why was that not, like you said, here you are, a teenager trying to get people to listen, because this should be a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, it really did. It's when that happened, and again, it was such a weird period of my life, because up to that point I was working the bus route. I was like singing choir. I was wearing my, rocking my suit to church. Like I was doing everything above and beyond. I was going door knocking more than just Saturday. Like I was doing a ton of stuff, mowing lawns. Like I was doing anything that needed to happen. And so it was weird seeing that this was the issue that turned everyone on me, and it became, oh, you're bitter. You're just a bitter this and that. I was like, I've never been the bitter kid. Like I talked to my dad about it just recently, and I was like, I was like, isn't it weird? We never had a stage of life where like we had the slam the door, like, I hate you, dad kind of phase of our relationship. I was like, we never had that kind of time. And I said, I can't honestly think of any, I've told my wife this too. I was like, I can't think of a time I've ever had like a legitimate argument with my dad over like, where we've been like raised our voices, like maybe where he's raised his voice at me a few times, which I probably needed. But it's like, when it came to this topic, it was like people were so blind to it being an issue. And there was actually one of the things that like sticks with me. And I actually have, when I started the podcast, I had a bunch of friends reach out from school that were like, remember that time when, and I was at school and, I saw Jesse on the property and he was doing like repairs or something during school hours. And I like left my classroom and went to my dad's office, which was on the far end of the auditorium. And I literally like shut his door. And again, I don't feel bad about this happening, but at the time it was like, I was so mad and I literally just started yelling. I was like, why don't you guys see this as a problem? And the thing I said in that conversation, which was like the only time I've ever had a conversation like that with my dad, and the conversation with my youth pastor was, you guys are supposed to keep us safe. And I don't feel like you can do that. And that's the thing that just, when I see cover-ups, when I see people try to slip things out quietly, all you're doing is sending a message to people, to teenagers in your church, to anybody in your church, is we cannot keep you safe. Like, we're here to make sure that we keep our ministry, like offerings coming in the same. We're here to make sure that we don't have liability. We're here to make sure A, B, and C, but our priority is not your safety. And especially when you're a teenager and like you're kind of reliant on the safety that your parents and your church provides, that's a scary place to be. And so, yeah, it was weird. It was just a weird period of time. And I don't fault, I look back at that situation, I'm like, there's a lot of things I could have done differently and like how I could have reported it and things like that. But it's just a weird, when you see it happen the first time, it's a weird thing to try to figure out, especially when you're a teenager, or even like you said, even a college student. I think most college students in IFB churches are high schoolers in average high schools. I mean, the amount of programming you've done to just accept how things are is pretty insane. But
Yeah.
I can talk a lot. This is why I have a podcast, because I can
before I move on to the next thing,
anything.
just out of curiosity. Okay, so this guy came to your church when you were a teenager. He came from his dad's church, I'm guessing, Tim Rules.
Yeah, from Tim's church. Yeah.
Was there ever a police investigation?
Yeah. So what happened was, so Jesse's wife found, and I won't say this because I don't want to give away someone that I know, but someone that I know was at the actual tournament where this happened. And I don't know if they'd like me sharing the name on the show, but anyway, they just told me just a week or two ago, they're like, I was at the game where he was confronted by his wife. And so basically what happened was, she found texts on his phone between him and their babysitter, and basically pulled the girl and him out to the hallway of the game. And like, Jesse, long story short, Jesse didn't come back to the game to finish coaching. And anyway, within like a night or two, Jesse's dad like basically called my pastor at the church and said, hey, me and my son have ministry differences, and I think he'd be better off like serving at a different church. Do you have any, would it be good for him to attend there? This based on the story of my pastor, which I don't have reason to doubt based on when he told me and everything. But anyway, so he told him like, hey, I think it'd be good for him to come down there, serve at a different church for a while. And so within a few days after that, I mean, he was there. The warrant was served from the police to the old property. Someone explained it to me, but like there was some legal loop around he was trying to do with like moving to a different area, so the warrant couldn't get to him and all that stuff. but anyway, yeah, there did end up being an investigation. He did plead guilty. He got like a few months of community service, and um, I, I don't I don't remember now. It's been a while since I've looked at this case specifically. I don't remember if he had to register as a sex offender or not, but I know he was on probation for 5 years. And I believe one of the restrictions of probation was that he wasn't supposed to be at a school or like within, it's kind of like sex offender guidelines. Because I remember there was something that they had done where I was like, he's not even supposed to be here. But anyway, yeah, there was police. He did plead guilty. And yeah, all that information was available. Like I shared the article with my pastor, with my youth pastor, and it, for whatever reason, he's still there today, introducing services. So, but
there's no words, Eric. There's no words.
right.
Okay, so let's move on. This has been about the series that I've been doing of episodes has been about abuse. Okay, so your podcast confronts abuse by giving a voice to the abused. And so I don't know, maybe you could talk about sort of what you were thinking when you started to where Eric is now, but what have you learned from 9 months of interviewing abuse victims? Or let me say it this way, abuse survivors.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of things. I would say the most consistent things come to mind first. One, I think most people think that nobody's going to listen to them, which again, I think people might expect that answer, but most people don't expect that anyone's going to listen, or they feel that the majority of people who listen will be against them. And honestly, like, coming out of some of these churches, like, that might be true. The majority of people, might be against you within your church over this, unfortunately. But the cool thing is now, like, I tell people, I'm like, there's literally thousands of people that follow my page that are ready to support anybody that comes forward. And I've seen people like, hey, reach out to me if you need to talk, if you need this. And so I love that now there's a community of people where I can say, hey, there's at least, 1,000 people in a Facebook group that are willing to, like, talk to you and make sure you're good and everything. So that's one thing. The second thing, and the hardest thing about the show is, like, there's a lot of people that reach out with stories who aren't ready to share yet. And I'll just preface this with saying, like, some people, it's not the right time. And I've talked to trauma specialists and things who say, like, hey, maybe the right first step isn't doing a, podcast or sharing their story in that format. I've had others that have, I had someone that came on my show because their therapist said that would be good for them to do. So, but the one thing I will say is a lot of people don't come forward until they know that someone else is being affected. And I want to share this because, not to guilt anybody who hasn't shared their story yet, but I like sharing this because I think most people don't think about it this way. So I have some people that have reached out who've said, oh, I was molested, or I was abused, or, fill in the blank with one of the topics we cover. But then they'll say, I just want to put it behind me and move on. It affected me. It's me overcoming this now. And, what I just always encourage people is, like, statistically, the odds of you being the only victim of that person, the only person who's been hurt by this person, is very, very, very low. I had Dr. Kelly Palfy on probably 20 episodes ago now. And she worked alongside I think she was actually on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but she worked in Canada with the police there in a huge investigation of this pedophile ring. And the people she interviewed, on average, had 150 victims each. And when I read that, I was like, I mean, I can't even think of 150 people to name. Like, that's a crazy number. And I see that stat in all kinds of situations, like people who have one or two victims usually have a lot more. And we just saw this with Hopewell. Once someone came forward, there was another one and another one and another one. And so I guess the other thing I've learned is just that people need to, I don't know how to say it. Nobody owes anybody anything with their story, but I just hope that the people who think that they're sharing their story won't help anybody, that's just not true. I've seen it time and again where, even if it's not the same abuser, someone sharing their story will lead to 4 or 5 people reaching out to me and say, hey, I'm ready to share my story, or hey, I'm ready to talk to this lawyer, this police officer, or this fill in the blank. And
Yeah,
so,
because sometimes there can be nuances or similarities that
right,
speak to someone.
right, exactly. And so, yeah, so the first thing I would say is just that, you know, people are ready to hear you. Number two, I would just say that um, there is merit in sharing your story. You're not, I think some people believe like, oh, I'll sound bitter or I'll sound like this. Um, so yeah, I would just say that's the other thing I've learned is like a lot of people just think there's not going to be value in sharing. And I think that's the best thing we can do is to share our stories and encourage other people. And then I would say like the last thing I've seen is there seems to be a very misguided view of how much power your pastor actually holds. Um, and I've had people that reach out who say, I would love to, I've had people, I'd love to talk to the police, but, I know my pastor is going to deny it, or, I know the police aren't going to investigate it. And it's like, no, they're going to investigate it, and your pastor might deny it, but they're going to look at the evidence around it. And it's just funny. There's a lot of people, I think, who, I may find is not the right word. It's just interesting that so many people are so scared of the quote unquote man of God in the church and buy into the lie that he's above the law in some way. And that's been something I've been surprised by a lot of people saying is like, oh, I'd love to come forward, but my pastor would deny it. And, or especially with teenage victims, like, oh, I just figured the police will come and they'll ask the pastor and he'll send them away. Like I've had like 2 or 3 guests that have said, I thought my pastor would send the police away if they came. And it's like, no, he can't do that. Like, I know he builds himself up like he could do all of that, but that's not within his grasp. So yeah, so I would say that's like the 3 biggest things. It's just like, I feel like people either feel like they can't share their story, like it won't have power, or that like, if they do, it's going to somehow backfire on them in some way. And all of those things have been proven, even in the course of the show, not to be true. Yeah, so,
Do you have a message, or do you have something that you'd like to say to? Because I think some of my audience, I think, are some that are in vocational ministry. Do you have anything that you'd like to say to those that are working in vocational ministry concerning this area, based on the experience and what you in the last 9 months, what you've learned and gathered, that would be helpful going forward?
yeah, I mean, the number one thing is just don't assume that you know how to handle these situations. And, the I never ended up going to Bible college, but I know plenty of people who have, and I've talked with a lot of people in ministry, and I can just say with certainty, Bible college doesn't prepare you, or seminary doesn't prepare you to handle situations like this. And look, here's the reality of it. If you put 100 to 200 people in a room, for years and years and years, there's going to be some bad people that slip in. And that's not the fault of you. That's not the fault of your staff. It's just a reality of the world that we live in. When it becomes your responsibility is when you're not taking the time to, one, prepare safeguards to keep those people from actually harming anybody. And when you do get one of these cases on your desk and someone says, hey, this happened, that's when you choose to become either an ally of the victim or the abuser. And so what I would say to pastors is, one, educate yourself. That doesn't mean like I think most pastors focused on like, oh, how am I going to counsel somebody who's been through this, or how am I going to, which is part of it, but do some basic research. The book right now I'm reading called, oh shoot, I'm going to blank on it. It's from Deepak, Reju. It is called On Guard. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Yeah, On Guard. That book is an excellent resource. I just sent that to a pastor just the other day, who asked me some questions. It's very practical. It even gets into like how to lay out a nursery in a safe way, check-in and check-out systems, things like that. And then also do some research from, A.N.C. Salter's book, Predators, like, how to identify this stuff. Just resources that'll help you both to understand like the security side, and then also like how to help survivors, and create safe spaces there. And then just the other thing I would say is, when a case comes across your desk, don't handle these situations in-house. You are, you have a vocation that is from God, and there are also, law enforcement is a vocation ordained by God, and it's been put there for a reason. And so, regardless of what anyone says, like if it's a child or anyone under 18, like call the police immediately. Like it shouldn't be, oh, here's our response team, or here's our team of deacons, or no, the first call should be to the police. And as a pastor, let your people know that they have the permission to call 911. They have the permission to call the police department. There shouldn't be a situation where, hey, if abuse happens, go to this elder in the church. Call the police, then go to the elder. And then just on the last part of that is, when you're trying to help victims of abuse, try to get them set up with a legitimate trauma counselor who's outside the church, who doesn't have a personal connection, someone who they can talk really openly with. You may not, most pastors probably aren't equipped to handle a trauma survivor. You can still speak, biblical truth and walk their, them and their families through things, but try to find someone who's a third party who specializes in this, who can help them. And then the very, very last thing I'll say is just listen to people who come to you. Like, before you know the facts, you don't know the facts. So make sure when someone comes forward to you and says, hey, something happened, that needs to be a moment you don't question their integrity. Don't question, did they quote unquote ask for it? What were they wearing? Like, get on the phone with the police, get people who know how to identify this stuff, and sit down then and start looking at the information in front of you. I wrote a blog article a while back called "They Don't Look Like Monsters," and the truth is, the people who are doing this stuff, who have gotten away with several victims, they got by for a reason. It's because no one suspects them. So don't just take your experience, don't take your, oh, he's a good volunteer, and let that overweigh what a teen girl is saying to you, or what a child is saying to you, or a man in the church is telling you. You need to really just understand that these people slip by, and you're not. Again, all I can keep saying is you're not prepared to handle this. And I know that because I'm not. I'm not the person to handle identifying these situations. And the more research I do, the more freaked out it makes me sometimes at how hard it is to spot this stuff. But just listen to people and don't cover stuff up. I think that would sum up everything I just said.
I echo that 1,000%. And I think that one of the things we see, or have seen in the IFB movement, which is garnered, why you're doing what you're doing, is because you mentioned get educated, educate yourself.
Right.
And why we see what we see is because there is no education, or there is a miseducation, because I think more, you hear the phrase, more is caught than taught. And I'm telling you, in a lot of these institutions, a lot of these Bible colleges, they're not talking about this in the classroom, but they're seeing, these young preachers that are going through there are seeing how leadership handles some of these situations. And so when it happens at their years later, they say, in fact, I'll say this, I was in some of my research on the history of the IFB movement, I came across some writings of Jack Hyles, on a book he wrote called Justice. And he basically taught how to move somebody. I mean, what he taught in that book is basically the handbook for moving people out quietly. I mean, and so in that way, it was almost formally taught. But I could have picked up that same idea of seeing how it was handled at the place that I was at, and that's how you do it in ministry. And I think that's the problem. And you have to educate yourself. I'm reading one for our church right now, as one of the elders at our church, becoming a church that cares well for the abused. And it's a conglomerate of different people, law enforcement, attorneys. Rachel DeHollander is a contributor into this book, and Chris Moles, and one of the guys on there, I think his name's Mike Edmondson, talked about, if you rolled up to your church and you see the windows busted out and you walked in and you notice that the sound equipment's gone, what's your first call? It's to the police, right? When you notice that illegal activity has just happened, your first response is to the police. But for some reason, when it comes to the illegal activity of sexual abuse, that has not been the first reaction of the church as a whole. And I think, why has that not been?
Right. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, and I guess you proved me wrong with talking about the book, which I need to check out. But with Jack Hiles, I was going to say, like, Hiles Anderson doesn't formally teach how to move around abusers from church to church. But look how many churches have copied the exact same mode of operation that Hiles did, moving people around. And yeah, it's right. It's caught, not taught. It's, oh, well, that's what he did. And a lot of these guys call these guys and ask, what would you do? And like, send him off, get him out of your church, do this. And so, yeah, just educate yourself and make sure you educate yourself from a good source. Someone who does have experience with this and knows how to address these situations. So,
and in this day and age, ministry workers have no excuse not to be educated, because we have a wealth of resources coming out that are already out to do that. And man, I am so thrilled with your work. I appreciate what you're doing. I think you're doing, listen, I'll say this openly. I think that what you're doing with the Preacher Boys podcast and the subsequent different outworkings of that is, I think it's biblical work. I really do. I think it's Ephesians 4 work, exposing the unfruitful works of darkness. And so I pray for that. I pray for those that are in the IFB movement, that they would change. And, I know that we say that there are some good ones out there. I pray that there is change, and there is change for the good there. And so I appreciate you taking the time to come on here and talk about those things. I think it's been awesome. I think it's been helpful. Hey, any update on the documentary?
So, I mean, COVID's kind of killed it. I tentatively, I'm still, 2021 is still the goal. I don't know that my goal is to launch it like the first few months of January, first few months of 2021. It'll still be 2021. It'll probably just be more summer at the rate I'm looking at now. My goal is to have quite a bit of shooting done over the next 2 months. And then the editing is going to be what takes a long time. But 2021 for sure still is the goal. It's probably just going to move from a spring to summer thing. I'm just going to work a little harder on the edit to get it faster. But it all depends on COVID right now. It really depends on when things start to really open up. But
you're in California, so that's a slow process.
Well, I'm in Nevada now, actually.
Oh, you're in Nevada.
But actually, a good chunk of interviews are in California, and I'm just okay. Whatever about the COVID. So I don't know. I just always, maybe it's because I am from liberal California, but I'm like, do I risk it? I don't know. So I don't know, but we'll see. The podcast is kind of taking a life of its own too. And I'm, basically putting out an audio documentary every week. So, but yeah, once I'm able to really shoot the way I need to with the doc, it should be summer 2021. So this time next year, I'm hoping it'll be all set to go. But yeah, we'll see. I'm kind of waiting for updates too to see where we can get moving. But
awesome. Again, thank you for coming
yeah,
on, and thank you for spending the time today.
yeah, for sure.
All right, guys, that wraps up today. And well, I did forget one thing. Where can, if by some chance somebody that's listening to my podcast does not follow you already, where can they follow your podcast or your output of information?
Yeah, I mean the number one place is just my website. It's Preacher Boys Doc. It's preacherboysdoc.com. That's like the place you can find resources I just mentioned. Both for churches and for survivors. And I'm working to really flesh that out a little bit more. You can find blog articles. You can find the podcast there. You can visit the abuser database, which kind of lists out a bunch of churches and things there. And then everywhere on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, it's at Preacher Boys DOC. So at Preacher Boys Doc. That's the next best place. And YouTube as well. If you just type in Preacher Boys, it'll pop up. Definitely go over there because I've got a lot of thumbs downs on on YouTube. So definitely head over there and drop a subscribe and a like here and there. So,
all right, guys, that wraps it up for today. Again, you can follow the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Give us a like, give us a share. And until next time, to God, not the pastor, be the glory.